All right. So this week, the Torah reading for this week is a section called Korach. Korach was a Levite who decided to, for whatever reason, and we'll discuss this, decided to rebel against the authority of Moses, of Moshe. And he kind of led rebellion and had a rather sticky end, unfortunately. He was warned about it, but he stuck to his guns, so to speak, and he unfortunately was swallowed up alive by the earth. He fell into a sinkhole or whatever you want to call it, that had been sort of prepared for him from the beginning of creation. So I guess he deserved it, and he warranted it, so that's the way it goes. Okay. But let us discuss the idea, like what actually happened. What was his disagreement about? Why was he disagreeing in the first place? Okay. In order to be able to understand that, we have to take a step back to the previous Torah reading, to the previous section that we read, which was last week. As you know, there's a new Torah section every week, and we finish it in a year, and then we go back to the beginning again. So last week's reading was about the spies in the desert. They were about to go into the land of Israel, and the Israelites come to Moses, to Moshe, and they say to him, we want to send spies into the land, ostensibly to see how best to conquer it. The spies come back with a report that was rather negative, and a dubiously negative report. They didn't have to report it the way they did, and but they had an intention. What was their intention? The intention really was, having spent some time in the desert so far, it wasn't a long time that they'd spent in the desert. They'd exited Egypt at Passover time, which is in the month of Nisan, sometime in April, in the regular today's calendars. And this incident happened on the 17th of Tammuz. The 17th of Tammuz is about 3 months later. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz. Yeah, 3 months later. And they had been living in the desert for 3 months. Life in the desert was unexpectedly hunky-dory, you could say. I suppose they were enjoying their lives in the desert. Why were they enjoying it? Because they didn't have to do anything. They actually didn't have to plant it, didn't have to sow it. They had the manna. They were sitting and learning about spirituality all day. They were learning, as it says, they were learning the Torah that they just received. They'd received the Torah not long before this at Mount Sinai, and they received the Bible, the first 5 books of Moses, or at least some of the teachings they'd received. There's a discussion actually amongst the sages, how they received the Torah. Did they receive the entire Torah at once, even before the events happened? And the Torah sort of predicted or prophesied that these events were going to happen all the way through to the end, to the death of Moses? Or did they write them out parashiot, section by section? Whatever it is, up until that time was for sure written out, so they knew what the history had been since the creation of the world and where things were at that point in time. But they knew also that they were on the way to the Holy Land. They're going to the Holy Land, and the spies, at least 10 of the 12, 2 of them came back with a positive report, Caleb and Joshua, and the rest of them came back with a very negative report. They started off reporting actually what they saw, but then they drew their own conclusions. One of the conclusions was that the nations over there are very mighty, even though Egypt was the mightiest nation in its time and had easily been overcome because they didn't have to do anything. God did it all with the 10 plagues and so on and so forth. And then they crossed the sea and they saw these amazing miracles, and nevertheless, when the spies went into the land of Israel, they came back with a negative report. But the negative report had besides having consequences, obviously, the negative report had a purpose to it. What was the purpose? The purpose was they actually wanted to stay, they wanted to remain in the desert. Now, there are some commentaries that explain, not the majority of commentaries, but some of them explain that what they wanted to do, they knew already that Moses would pass away. They knew that he was going to die after he struck the rock and so on. They knew that he was going to die, and they wanted to remain together with him. He was the one who had taken them out of Egypt, and he was the one that provided for them. He was the one that rescued them, and so on and so forth. And therefore, according to this interpretation, they wanted to stay with him, and that's why they said they wanted to be in the desert. They wanted to stay in the desert. However, that does not seem to be the majority opinion. And in fact, it seems to be somewhat of a strange opinion in some ways, but let's not go into all the details thereof. Nevertheless, the majority of opinions say that the spies just simply wanted to stay in the desert. They wanted to live off the fat of the land, so to speak. In other words, live off the manna and the water from Miriam's well, and they could live in a state of complete spirituality, enveloped by the clouds of glory, taken care of completely by God, instructed on a daily basis by Moses, by Moshe, and by the people that he set up to instruct them, the Sanhedrin, 70 elders, and so on and so forth. They were living in the lap of luxury as far as they were aware. They didn't, as far as they were concerned, they didn't have great desires to have their own land and to live in the land of Israel. But as we know what happened with the spies, they lost their lives, the 10 spies, and as a result of this, what was essentially a sin, because they did not do what they'd given him the idea that they did not want to join at all with Moses. What they had said was as follows: if the previous opinions, in other words, those the spies who were then taken down, and they were taken down to their graves. In other words, they were killed at that time. Why then, said this group of people, the followers and the friends of Korach, why was it that happened? According to them, they said that was because they wanted to stay in the world of spirituality. They wanted to live in the spiritual world. However, besides living in the world of spirituality, there's another way of living. It seems to him, it seemed to them, it seemed to the followers of Korach and to him himself, that we can completely abandon the spiritual world, and we have to look at things completely from the world, from the point of view of the physical world. They couldn't handle freedom. Yeah, they couldn't handle freedom. They couldn't handle freedom to a certain extent. But what they wanted to do is they didn't want not freedom. They didn't want the spirituality that the previous the ones who were sucked into the earth and never came back, the spies, they wanted to live in a state of spirituality. They didn't want to go into the Holy Land. They wanted to stay in the desert. Why did they want to stay in the desert? Simply because the desert presented them with an opportunity to emphasize cleaving to God above. All they had to do was cleave to the clouds. They had to spend their time doing absolutely nothing except studying and meditating and so on and so forth. When Korach came along and saw that these men had been sucked up by the earth, he came to the conclusion that the exact opposite is the way to go. The exact opposite is that you have to do things extremely practical, down to earth. Down to earth is the only thing that's important. When Korach came and he made a rebellion against Moses, what was his rebellion? Essentially, his rebellion was that the world, the physical world, is all that we need to actually worry about. And in the physical world, everybody is essentially equal. Moses had made various tribes and various levels, and he himself represented a much loftier level than most of the people of the 12 tribes. There was first of all Moses, and under him was his brother Aaron, and under them were Joshua and various other people who were studying for roles of leadership. And then there was the 70 elders, and then there was basically the heads of the tribes, and then the tribes. And the tribes were sort of spread out. Along comes Korach and says to Moses, this is impossible. The most important thing is only the land of Israel, and we should go in, and everything has to be equal. Everyone is equal. Yes, it's true that the land is going to be divided up into 12 sections, but everyone's going to get a piece of land, and that's the only thing that's important. What's not important is that there should be any kind of hierarchy of authority. What's not important is that there should be a Moses above everybody else, and then as you go down the various the ladder of authority, so there's all kinds of different there's all kinds of different levels. According to Korach, everyone should be equal. We should have, in some sense or another, the concept of a communist society. Where's a communist society? Obviously, it doesn't come to various abilities to think and abilities to appreciate things, on the spiritual plane, but when it comes to the physical plane, everybody's equal. That was his way of looking at things. Question asked: are we close with Korach and Moshe? Was it quite shocking he's speaking against him? Yes, it was quite shocking in a way, speaking against him, but it's not something that had never happened before. There's a matter of discussion. There's always a matter of discussion. And in fact, if anyone has ever been to a yeshiva, you will find that arguments go on constantly in yeshiva. There's one sees it from this point of view, that another one sees it from a different point of view. You sit and you argue it out and you discuss it, right? And then sometimes it comes to the concept of compromise. No, you're not misspelling. So sometimes there's a concept of in fact always there's a concept of compromise. But where does compromise come from? And what kind of compromise was it that that we usually suggest? Well, there's a compromise between the spiritual and the physical. The physical is one end of the spectrum. The physical is another end of the spectrum. So between the two of them, spiritual and physical, you have some kind of a compromise. In other words, if we want to live as a soul within a body, there has to be some kind of compromise. Now, when we say that there's a compromise, it doesn't mean to say that you have to compromise on your principles or that you have to compromise on your values. No, that's not necessarily the idea of compromising on your spiritual, your values, what it is that you have to do. In fact, a person is expected to fulfill all of the mitzvot, all of the commandments of the Torah that he's obligated to do. However, what Korach's approach was that everything has to be done in a physical sense. Forget about all the spirituality. All that we're connected with is the physical world. Now, Moses was again caught between a brick and a hard place. I think they call it something like that. Yeah, he was caught in a bit of a bind. Why was he caught in a bit of a bind? Because the whole concept of extremism of one sort or another was really the opposite of what he was thinking, what he was taught, what he knew. Let me just explain. There is a concept. Let me show you a concept in Kabbalah. Here we go. Here is the idea of the, let me just see if I can make it a bit smaller. Yeah, I'll make it smaller so you can see the whole thing. Well, I guess I'd have to show even smaller than that. Let's see here. Okay, here we are. Here is the 10 Sfirot. Now, the way the 10 Sfirot are arranged, at least according to the way the Arizal explains them, the way he explains the Sfirot of Atzilut. So you have Keter, Chochma, and Bina. Keter, Chochma, Bina, that's three, that triad. And if you don't count Keter, then you count Dat. So it will be Chochma, Bina, and Dat. Okay. That is the first triad of Sfirot. And that's where everything really essentially begins. But then you have the next line down, the next section down, I suppose you could say. This forms, at least in the world of Tikkun, in other words, the world which is created after the world of rectification, the world which is created after the world of Tohu, which I'm going to explain in a minute. The world of rectification is when there are six sphirot, and they're arranged in 3 columns. As you can see, all of the sphirot essentially are arranged in 3 columns, but they're arranged in 3 columns. So there's the right-hand column, the concept of chesed, kindness. Then there's the left-hand column, the concept of gvura, withdrawal. That's chesed could be defined as reaching out. Gvura is reaching in. Tiferet is the balance of the 2 of them. Netzach is bringing that chesed into reality. In other words, bringing the reaching out into reality down to a lower level. And Hod is the idea of reaching within and glorifying that which is within, glorifying things on a higher spiritual level. Yesod combines the 2 of them. Yesod is called the foundation, and defines the 2 of them. It combines the 2 of them, and then brings it into Malchut. Malchut, the first, essentially female sphira of these, right? Essentially the female sphira, although Bina is also a female sphira, but Malchut is a female sphira in the sense that it's a makabel, it receives from above. The whole concept of feminine, if you remember the story at the beginning of creation, there's the sun and the moon. God creates the sun and the moon. And the sun is the one that gives off light, and the moon is the one that receives its light from the sun. It doesn't have any light of its own. It only receives light from the moon, right? It receives light from the moon. From the sun. The moon receives light from the sun. Initially, we are told in Kabbalah, in the Zohar, and various other places, initially, and the Midrash as well, initially, the moon had a light of its own. But when it came with a complaint, and this is obviously not to be understood literally, but the moon came with a complaint to God. And the moon said, 2 kings cannot use 1 crown. 2 kings cannot use 1 crown. What is that king? What is that? What are those kings? Those kings are the sphirot of chesed, gvura, tiferet, etc., these sphirot over here, as opposed to malchut. In other words, the sun and the moon cannot both have the same crown. They cannot both be luminaries. The verse says right in the beginning of Genesis, the 2 luminaries that were in the heaven, the 2 luminaries that were in the heavens. But the moon complained about this, and therefore it was reduced. Now, what does this all mean? It simply means that malchut originally was also a luminary. It also had a light of its own, but because of its complaint, so to speak, that light was removed, it was taken away, and now it only receives light from chesed, gvura, tiferet, netzach, and hod, right? But the relationship between the 2 of them is a symbiotic relationship. In other words, these sphirot over here, these 6 sphirot, have the desire to give, and malchut, the final sphira, has the necessity to receive, not just the desire, but the necessity to receive. So, with the six sphirot and malchut, they form a kind of a partnership, right? What's the partnership? One is the giver, one is the receiver. This partnership is parallel, by the way, to the human condition as well, male and female. Male and female, he created them. Initially, they were created as one thing, and then they were separated. They were separated in order to create 2 entities, and the greatest achievement that they can achieve initially, the greatest achievement they can achieve is to come together as a couple, reunite as a single couple, become one. And that's essentially what we call the uniting of the partzufim of Zer, Anpin, and Malchut. These 6 sphirot over here from Chesed to Yesod are called Zer Anpin, the small visage, as opposed to the larger visage which is up above. I'm not going to discuss it, but the smaller visage of Zer Anpin, and that unites with Malchut, and they form a bond called Yichud Zun. The Yichud, the oneness, the unification of Zer Anpin and Nukva, the female Elwen Malchut. Right. So the 2 of them together form an entity. Is it a divisible entity? Yes, it can be a divisible entity, unfortunately. And that, in fact, was one of the things that happened at the time of when Malchut argued, when the moon, so to speak, argued that it couldn't share a crown. It could share a crown. It could share a crown if they both formed a single unit together. But if the moon became a separated unit, in other words, it wanted to have its own independent existence, then unfortunately, things would fall apart. And that's exactly what happened. This is, in fact, to go back to the story of Korach. It says about Vayikach Korach, and Korach took. What did he take? He took a Ve'itpelei Korach. Korach, it says in Targum, in the Aramaic translation, Korach took apart, he took asunder, he broke things asunder, he broke apart that unity. How did he break apart the unity? Because he argued that the world of physicality is a separate existence from the world of spirituality. Physicality and spirituality, never the twain shall meet to a certain extent. The main thing now is the world of physicality. He wanted to deny the world of spirituality. What therefore happened? The way the Sfirot were later were actually initially all of the Sfirot were compiled together as a single unit. But what he did, what Korach did, was what is called the world of Tohu. The world of Tohu meaning the world of chaos. What was the world of chaos? The world of chaos was only a two-line formation rather than a triad formation, but a two opposing forces situation. So what Korach did was the Itpelei Korach. He split things into two. Instead of bringing them in groups of three, where the third one joins together the other two. In other words, there's a compromise between the two, which now becomes a third thing, where each gives of itself and therefore forms a third entity. Korach's whole approach was that things have to be purist. You can't have something in the middle, right? You can't have something that's a half of this and a half of that, or part of this and part of that. You have to have purity. He was a purist, right? You have to have either the left column or the right. Well, you have to have the left column and the right column, but something in the middle has to either go to the left or it has to go to the right. That's what it means that ve'itpelei Korach. Korach split things apart. How did he split things apart? Because he split them into two columns. And that was the source of his instability. He was the one that caused instability, because when there's only two columns and not a third one in the middle, machriya beinehem, that mitigates between the two of them, and how shall I say, instead of mitigates, another word, that balances the two of them. He wasn't into balance, he was into the extremes. So we see therefore that Korach, what he did, he was an extremist. His idea was you have to be a purist. You have to go to either one extreme or the other extreme. Either the extreme of spirituality, which we saw before with the spies, did not work. They wanted to remain in the realm of spirituality. And he said, no, forget about it. It didn't work. They were punished. It's obviously not the right thing. Therefore, we have to go altogether into the world of physicality. We have to regard physicality as being the primary issue and essentially all that there is. That's what he was all about, and that's what he tried to do. Now, what was his mistake? His mistake was that things are not black and white. They're in between shades. And he was not prepared to recognize, let me just see what the chat says. He was not prepared to recognize such a thing. How did he? Yeah, it's a good question, Aidan, a very good question. How's this you struggling to understand how he got such an extremist view? Let me just see before. Did he get his idea from a source of fear that his enemy would be simply brutal if he forgot the material world? No, I don't think he forgot the material. I see what you mean. His emphasis became the material world. And he felt that if they had been punished for their spirituality, wanting to live in the desert. In other words, wanting to lock themselves away, so to speak, in a monastery and in a house of study, and not deal with the world at all, which is actually what the desert represents. That was the previous generation. That was the generation of the spies. They did not want to have to deal with a physical world. They wanted to remain in the spiritual world. And Korach came along and he said, obviously, if that was wrong, then we have to go into the physical world, and we have to go hands and feet. We have to go into the physical world completely. So that entered him into an extremist kind of a view. Don't forget, they had not. I only just started learning from Moses. They had not really been learning from Moses all of this time. What they did not understand was the idea of compromise. Now, you find this a lot actually with extremely religious and extremely anti-religious people. None of them are willing to compromise, right? Neither of them are willing to compromise. And it's a very sad thing in many ways, because if you think about it, the best way to approach another person is not to judge where he's holding, right? Not to judge him, and not to, and certainly not to judge them negatively. Wherever it is that they're holding, you can present your view of things and your opinion of things, but to expect them to achieve the opposite end of the spectrum overnight is not only immature, it's just foolish, right? You can't expect people to come from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. All of Judaism is really very much in the middle of the road, the middle spectrum. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that in a private sense, a person should be only somewhat religious? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means that when you approach another person, the way you grasp things is not necessarily the way you should impose things on other people. Now, Moses understood this. He understood that sometimes people are not on the level yet where you can expect from them what you expect from yourself. What Korach expected was everyone was going to follow in his lead. And in fact, there were many people that did follow in his lead. The 250 heads of the Sanhedrin, there were 250 very prominent rabbis from the tribe of Reuben, that actually followed in his lead. And they, and then there was his family and various others, Datan and Aviram, and so on and so forth. There were people that followed in his lead and felt that this was the kind of leader that they needed. They were going to go into the land of Israel, and now what they had to focus on was the physical, only the physical, to the exclusion of the spiritual. Moses says, no, on the contrary, the whole idea is to make a balance between the two. Find a balance. How do you find a balance? Not by having two extremes, the two arms of the world of Tohu, the two extremes of the world of Tohu, but having a middle column, a balance between them. Yes, you can have certain things that are on the right column, certain things on the left column, but you have to know how to balance them properly in the middle. Does that mean, therefore, that someone who knows how to balance them is less religious, so to speak, than someone who takes an extreme? On the contrary, balancing the demands of the spiritual world and the demands of the physical world, knowing how to balance them, and everyone has their way of balancing things. There's no one answer exactly how it should be balanced, but going to one extreme or the other extreme is an extremist position. It's not the way things should be. It is. Someone says that's democracy. That's democracy if you vote about it. Yeah. Democracy is kind of voting about it. And yes, it's true that democracy to a certain extent is a good thing. On the other hand, it has to a certain extent a lack of leadership. There's a statement of the sages which says like this: "Pnei hador k'pnei hakelev." The face of the generation is like the face of a dog. So what's the explanation there? One of the commentaries explains, one of the Hasidic commentaries explains that what is the face of a dog? If you take your dog out to walk and you let your dog off the leash, or even if your dog is on the leash, but certainly if you let him off the leash, he trots ahead a little bit and then he looks back. He trots ahead a little bit and looks back. So when we say pnei hador k'pnei hakelev, the face of the door is like the face of a dog, when we say faith, we mean the leaders, right? The leaders of the generation are like a dog, like the face of a dog. A dog is always looking back to see what his master is doing. In other words, the leader is always looking back to see what the people want, and that's democracy. It's not always a good thing. It's a good thing in the sense that there should be a democratic ability for everybody to achieve the same things according to how much effort they put in. But it shouldn't just be that everyone gets the same results without the same effort. Effort has to be commensurate. Results have to be commensurate with the effort. And what Korach essentially wanted was that the effort is irrelevant. Everybody has to be the same. He sort of had a communist mentality, a socialist mentality. Everyone has to be the same. They have to be treated the same. There's no degrees. And that is also incorrect. The idea has to be that you achieve according to your input. Now, not everybody is born the same ability. Some people are born, let's say, for example, in music. Some people are born extremely musical, and with a little bit of study, they turn out to be, a Beethoven, a Chopin, or whatever it is. They turn out to be a great musician. It sort of runs through them. Whereas other people can't put two notes together and make sense of it. Like it just doesn't work for them. But everybody has their thing, and everybody has their hour, and everybody has their requirements in terms of developing themselves. When a person looks into his own 4 cubits, in other words, he looks into his own surroundings and the way the world around him affects him. Is he timid, too timid to go out and change the world irrespective of somebody else's powers? He has his own, everybody is granted a unique type of power. Everybody, otherwise they wouldn't be in the world in the first place. Everyone's granted a unique approach and a unique ability to do something that nobody else could do, essentially. Nobody else could achieve that kind of thing. Now, is it possible that this can go to an extreme? Of course, it's possible that it can go to extremes, and that's what happened with Korach. Korach felt that the extreme that had to be manifested in order to counterbalance the previous generation was a total emphasis on the physical world, a total emphasis on the physical world. Everything had to be the same, everything had to be equal, and you couldn't have some people involved in the world of spirituality. Everybody had to be involved equally in the physical world. Yeah, it's called democracy. Yes, to a certain extent, it's called democracy. And democracy is not necessarily the best way to go. How is it possible that Korach came to this? Aiden is asking, how is it possible that even though he received from Moses, he received from Moshe, nevertheless, how was he, why was he an extremist? Because he felt that the main thing is not to compromise and not to do just the best at what you're capable of, but everybody has to be forced into doing things in a certain way, in the way that he saw correct, in the way that he saw as ultimate, where everyone have a completely equal share of everything. Now we know that kind of communist mentality is kind of foolish, because really it can't work. You have to have leadership, and you have to have fellowship, I suppose you could call it, right? And leadership was something that he, yes, he was punished for wanting to, those people were punished in the previous generation for wanting to stay in the desert. They wanted to stay in the world of spirituality. They didn't want to descend into the world of physicality. It's called democracy. Yeah, it is called democracy, right. Alan, how do we know when we need to speak up or keep the work internal? I'm assuming if I keep it internal until I know that, but can you throw us a bone? Yes. Okay, so Lynn is asking a very, very important question. How do we know when it's time to protest? When it's time to protest? Well, there are 2 ways really of going about this. One is to seek advice from someone who's traveled that path, or from someone who has the wisdom of the situation. You seek your wisdom from those who are wiser than us, and act accordingly. That's one possibility. The other possibility is to try and form partnerships with people of one's equal and see if it works that way. The main work that we have to do initially is internal. Does that mean that external work is anathema? No, not at all. The initial work, when one is in one's younger years, now when I say younger years, it doesn't mean necessarily younger in age, it just means younger in spiritual wisdom. During the younger years, when a person is not doesn't regard himself as spiritually wise, that's when he or she is essentially a follower. You follow advice, you ask advice, you follow advice, and you do the best you can from that point of view. At some point in time, most people, although not all people, but most people don't become just followers, but also become leaders in one sense or another, perhaps leaders in a small group, or leaders in their own family, or leaders of much larger groups and things like that. And then what the leader has to do is guide his followers in a way that each person nevertheless has free choice. One of the differences that you see between Jewish rabbis and Indian gurus, to a certain extent, now I'm not speaking for everybody, but you do find this to a certain extent, that as far as the guru is concerned, everybody has to follow his dictates and do the path that he chooses for you. Otherwise, you might as well go find another one. In Judaism, it's not really like that. In Judaism, a person is allowed to look around and choose the path that is best. Yes, it's true that one is expected to be a whole person. In other words, in terms of thought, speech, and action, you're supposed to have all three of them. But everybody has a different emphasis. There are those who sit and study for most of their time, and there are those who sit and study only for maybe a few minutes or a couple of hours a day, not more than that. And they're much more active people. So the contribution that a person has to make is according to who he is. Now, sometimes who you are, if a person doesn't know, that can be revealed by name analysis, by the analysis of your name and how it fits in with various verses in the Torah. That's something I'll do on the side, by the way. There are those who do not need any kind of analysis. They know exactly what it is that they have to do from day one. So the best thing, nevertheless, is to always consult with others or with one's superiors only in the sense of who've gone down the spiritual path before and may be able to advise you. And it's possible they may be able to give some advice as to how to proceed. We can't achieve unity unless the I becomes a you. To reduce your ego and relate to the godliness in the other. Yes, that's a very good point. That is actually true. So not acknowledging or balancing different points of view is denying that person's purpose. It may well be, yes. Sometimes the person's simply wrong, and maybe it's not possible to acknowledge his point is true, but it's certainly beneficial to acknowledge, or at least to try and clarify what that person's point is, and perhaps point out the holes in it if you do believe that there are holes in it. Maybe the person will show you, indicate to you, explain to you that there are in fact no holes in his theory of the way he's supposed to be. But nevertheless, it's certainly worth a discussion. Discussion is very important, and that's what's called aseh lecha rav uknei lecha chaver. Make for yourself a teacher, a rav, a master, and acquire for yourself a friend. In other words, a friend is someone who's on your level, more or less, and a master is someone who's been there before, been there, done that, or at least can see the way clearer than most. Okay, so you're understanding correctly, Aiden, that understand you can find the light and purpose in that balance. Absolutely. When things are unbalanced, when people take extreme positions, as Korach did, when that's called the Itbalei Korach, he split things into two dimensions. In other words, the right side and the left side, the side of giving and the side of taking, and the side of descent, the side of ascent. And he couldn't balance the two of them. He didn't feel that there was any possibility of balancing the two of them. Whereas the spies had chosen spirituality altogether, he chose physicality altogether. The truth is a mixture of the two. You have to sometimes be in the spiritual realms and sometimes in the physical realms. Okay, so you're asking a question, how could they be totally spiritual? They did not freely choose that spirituality. Hashem gave them liberty in getting out of Egypt, but did not give them freedom that they had to learn and earn. The spies did have that freedom. But they should have understood from themselves that since the soul is manifested in a body, there's requirements for the soul and there's requirements for the body. There's the illumination of the soul, and then there is the refinement of the body. And the two of them have to work hand in glove. I love the culture of questioning around tradition. I think there's benefit in trusting the teacher implicitly, but again, balance. Yes, there is definitely a benefit in trusting a teacher if that's a trustworthy teacher. I mean, unfortunately, there are teachers around that have an unbalanced view, and they will lead a person astray, to certainly not deliberately, maybe, but the chapter in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, says as follows: what is the path that a person should choose? And the answer it gives is the path that is Tiferet. Tiferet is the middle column of the Sfirot, right? I'll just show you again. The middle column of the Sfirot is called Tiferet. Share screen, 1 second. Share. Yeah, this is the middle column here. This one here. This here is the middle column, right? Tiferet represents the middle column. It's the middle of the middle. This is all the middle column, but this is the middle column of the middle. As you can see, in this schema over here, it's right in the middle, Tiferet. So it says, what is the primary modus operandi of what's it? What do I do here? Oops. Just 1 second. I don't know what I did exactly here. I think what did I do? Oh, here we are. Stop share. There you go. Okay. Sorry about that. Let me think here. Okay. So, yes, questioning our tradition. Yes, it's true that when you're on the road, you have to follow the lead of somebody, but there is, I mean, the entire Talmud is a backwards and forwards discussion and disagreements and arguments. Yes, we come to a conclusion. Let's say, for example, there's an argument of, let's say, 3 or 4 sages, and 3 sages say like this, and 1 or 2 say like the other opinion. We go according to the majority. We go according to the majority opinion, because that is how we make decisions. We make decisions according to the majority. It doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't ask the questions. The questions have to be asked. It's a very important part of finding balance, is to ask the questions. I know in other religions they demand an absolute faith. This is not the case in Judaism, and you may argue, well, what happened with Korach then? Korach was not one who asked questions. He tried to lay down the law, right? He tried to lay down that this is how it has to be. Since after the spies were done away with, because they were gotten rid of, so to speak, now we have to go in this particular way. We have to go in the way that I'm saying. This is incorrect. There has to be a discussion. There has to be a whole integrated approach, and an approach which is correct for the majority of people, not just for some. Yes, it's true that within the approach that is generally sanctified and ratified by the majority of people, there's wiggle room, there's room for movement, and there are even extremes in that particular. A person can be more pious or less pious, and so on and so forth, but nevertheless, there is a general consensus as to how we should go. Terry asks, "Oh, you like a little like a gemstones we're found in nature don't shine, but ever can be polished and eventually shine as a unique gem shines. And we are born with nature, but through the shaping and polishing of our spiritual lessons, we shine forth with God's intended, with God's intents." Yes, I'm not sure what the last two words mean, intents to, and I'm not sure what that means. Maybe it's a misprint. But yes, that is exactly, it's a beautiful analogy. The analogy is that we are like diamonds, and diamonds need to be polished, and sometimes not just polished, but they have to be cut right. Sometimes there's parts of the diamonds that are damaged, that has to be cut off. Now, when we say cut off, we don't mean it literally, obviously, but we do mean that a person's direction in life sometimes has to be changed towards a different facet. It's not always an easy thing to do, but that is unfortunately in some cases what needs to be done. For example, I'll just give you an example. I'm dealing recently with a person who has an extremely negative approach to everything. Everything is a problem, and everything is, to a certain extent. Sort of the joke that is told is, if you smell a bad if you smell a bad smell constantly, check your mustache. Maybe there's something stuck in it. You know what I'm saying? That's the is this God's intention? Yes, intention is the correct word. Yes. So God's intention is that there should be a path towards becoming a gem in your own right. Yes, you have to be polished a little bit, you have to be cut right, and so on and so forth in order to reveal the inner beauty. But that's the process of growing up in Jewish thought, and particularly in Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought. The truth is in all thought, but all Jewish thought, but in some paths, like the path of what's called Musar, for instance. Musar means kind of sermonizing. It's the ethical, studying ethics and so on. Sometimes the Musar approach is too harsh on the person themselves, because the person starts to think of themselves as inadequate and unnecessary and incapable and so on and so forth. And that's obviously not a good way to work. The best way to work things is to reveal the inner core, the inner beauty, the inner light of each particular person. Now, that might demand a lot of work. It might demand a lot of effort on the part of the person who is helping them to reveal, in other words, their teacher or their guide, to help them reveal those inner, that inner light. Yes, it can take some effort, but nevertheless, the effort is generally worth it. And again, this is one of the things that Korach wanted, to ignore, because he felt that it's either black or white. If it's black, it's black. If it's white, it's white, and there's nothing in between. There's no gray areas. That's the way he felt about things, and he was wrong from that point of view. Yeah. So they can eventually shine. Exactly. Yeah. I don't know if it's the root of alchemy, but if that's what alchemy is trying to achieve, making some, bringing out the inner beauty, the inner qualities, the inner light in the person, I don't think that's what alchemy is trying to do. I think alchemy is trying to manipulate outward forces. I don't think it's trying to reveal the inner core. Isn't that the issue of LGBTQ male on one side and female on the other, giving and receiving, and compromise balance between the two? I'm not sure what you mean by the issue of LGBTQ in this context. I think what you're saying, if I'm not mistaken, I think what you're saying is that in the LGBTQ community, a person is perhaps trying to be both at the same time. Now, that's not necessarily, that doesn't really work, does it? It's a question I'd rather not speak about in public. It's something that can be addressed in private if anyone wants to discuss it. But suffice it to say that the idea that you should be something that you're not, something you weren't born as. Don't forget, genetics is an important component of our being, and it's there for a reason. A person was born male for a good reason or female for a good reason, and that is, it has to do with the type of soul that a person has, either coming from ultimately Zeranpin, the male, or Malchut, the female. And does that mean to say that the female is on a lower level than Zeranpin? On the contrary, Eshet Chayil Ateret Ba'ala, a woman of valor, is the crown of her husband. And they do say that the Sphira of Malchut ultimately returns to the state of crown, returns to Keter, to the highest level of all. And that's where it comes from. All right, let's go through some of these other messages. Both opinions may very well be true. I'm not sure what you're talking about over there. But anyway, okay. The difference between gender and sexuality interpreted as male, female energy versus biology is its own massive discussion. Yes, I agree with that. So the dissenting opinion always gets recorded first. And we also see that the public opinion is many times wrong. If there are relationships that we return and review the dissenting opinion frequently, yes. That's part of learning Talmud, is to review the dissenting opinion, understand the basis of the dissenting opinion, and very often come to the conclusion that the dissenting opinion is correct in certain circumstances. That is absolutely true. You'll find in Jewish law that they study both opinions. The general opinion is we rule like one of the views, the majority view and not the minority view, but we do understand and agree and practice the minority opinion in certain circumstances. The minority opinion is sometimes the only thing that can be done in certain circumstances, and therefore we follow it without attempting to let's call it banish it altogether. And the dissenting opinion in the Talmud always gets recorded first, yes, because it is important. Yeah. Okay, similarity between this and when Sarah and Aaron, then they I don't think Sarah, I think I mean Miriam. Miriam and Aaron when they questioned Moses, yes. Probably Miriam, you mean, yeah. All right, let's go a little bit further. Alchemy is the process of taking raw material and turning it into gold. But yeah, I hear you. I'm not into alchemy, but I understand it that any tradition is an in and out of dimension. So I hear you. Yeah. I'm biologically female, I identify as gender fluid, and I think there's a lot of merit in finding that balance between the energies of male and female. Always struggling for finding a balance between metaphorical and literal interpretations of she, he, male, female, and religious texts. Yeah, there's a lot to discuss there. I don't know that this is the right forum for it, but there is a lot to discuss there. Now, again, advocating for something for oneself, is certainly something that one discuss. Advocating for other people is maybe not the right thing to do. In other words, if a person feels that they have both qualities, and the truth is that everyone, to a certain extent, male has female qualities and female has male qualities to some extent. The question is what dominates, and how do we balance things in the proper way, together with the physical gender that a person was born. In other words, a person can balance their personality with their gender. And you get, for example, some women who regard themselves as women who are very domineering, right? They sort of take a lead from the male domineering, generally domineering attitude. Now in America, it's not so common these days, but I mean, for men to be that domineering, but depends on which people you hang out with. But anyway, it's something that does bear discussion and could be talked about. I personally feel that gender fluidity is, or at least can be, the cause of confusion or the result of confusion. Confusion, not necessarily mental confusion, but spiritual confusion. What is that we're supposed to do, and how one can amalgamate both things and combine them with one's physical being in such a way that everything complements everything else and everything completes everything else. Okay. Doesn't mean to derail. Yeah, you didn't derail. It's fine. How Korach's experience is resolved. Looking forward to see how Korach's experience is resolved. Yeah. So Korach's experience was not resolved. He descended into purgatory, essentially. He was swallowed up by the earth, and so were all of his family. However, his sons privately disagreed with him. After this whole incident, his sons kind of disagreed with him, and it says that they were actually rescued. They, because we see later that they composed more than a dozen psalms in the book of Psalms. The Psalms only in the time of King David, but King David heard the Psalms from the sons of Korach, whether they heard it spiritually or where they heard it when they were in purgatory, I don't know, but they were lifted up to a higher place of purgatory, and later on, apparently, they were reincarnated into various other people. So they did. The three sons of Korach did rectify their indiscretion, or their father's indiscretion. Swallowed up by the earth, that means something larger in your branch of Judaism. What does the earth represent? Yeah, someone will say obsessed with the earth plane would be swallowed up by it. Yeah. When he was swallowed up by the earth plane, what does that mean in our branch of Judaism, which is normative Judaism, Hasidism, essentially, the Hasidic approach? What does the earth represent? The earth represents Malchut. The earth represents Malchut. The concept of be fruitful and multiply. The earth represents the receiver. The earth represents, interestingly enough, if you think about it, of all the planets, the only one, which is the only one of the planets that is not named after a Greek god? And the answer is Earth. Earth is the only one. You have Neptune, you have Venus, you have all of these are named after Greek gods. It's the only one not named after. So, yes, something swallowed up by the earth. Swallowed up by the earth means that he was swallowed up by physicality. He lost his sense of spirituality. He lost the sense of a multidimensional world. All he could relate to was the physical, to the physical world. That's a good question. He could only relate to the physical world. I think that someone mentioned this before. Yeah, literally ending that someone obsessed with the earth plane would literally be swallowed by it. And that's what happens to a certain extent when a person becomes obsessed with some particular thing. He can be swallowed up by it. Doesn't have to be, but can be. I'll give you an example. There are some people that become completely, their minds become so fixated on wealth, let's say, for example, that they lose their humanity. Other people are not like that. For example, take someone like Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett remains a very clear-headed, open-minded, I believe anyway, open-minded person that considers a number of different points of view and does not sink into some kind of mindset that is self-destructive ultimately. All right, any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? That is the story. Sorry about the middle part of it where I kind of lost my focus and there was noises around here and someone's bothering me and so on. But all right, any other questions? If we have time, could you talk about the Korach name, the meaning of his name? A few people have asked. Yeah, the meaning of the name Korach actually comes from the word Kerach. Let me write it in Hebrew, 1 second. Share screen. Yeah, I'll write it for you. Word Korach. The word Korach comes from the name Korach comes from the word Kerach. Kerach means ice. What is ice? Ice is something that was initially liquid and has been solidified. But ice is very liable to crack. It also, ice does not generally support life as is. If you know, I mean, it doesn't really happen this way, but thank God it doesn't happen this way. But generally, when a river or a pond, a lake freezes over, somehow or another, there's always some water at the bottom that doesn't freeze. But if it would freeze over, let's say in laboratory conditions, it would freeze over completely. Life is not able to usually survive in that kind of atmosphere. So Korach means two things. It means ice, but it also hints to rigidity and the inability to support life. And it doesn't take much to make it unstable. It can crack apart, but it also doesn't take much to return it to stability, just a little bit of warmth, right? A little bit of warmth will melt the ice and then it returns to a state of water. Unfortunately, well, maybe I shouldn't say it unfortunately, but the truth is that most of us in a similar kind of a situation. Sometimes we get very extremist in a point of view of one thing or another, and we're not fluid. We don't approach things from a fluid point of view. Yes, it's true that there are certain things in life that have to be, certain principles that have to remain rigid. There's no compromise in certain things. For instance, thou shalt not murder. There's no compromise, right? It's not you can murder a little bit here and there, on occasion. There's no compromise, right? There's that's the way it should be. That certain principles you can't compromise on. You shall not steal. Don't steal and finish. There's no compromise on stealing. You shall not worship foreign other gods and so on. There's no compromise in that kind of thing. But in life situations, there's certain things, the 10 Commandments, you don't compromise. But there's many of the other aspects of life, there's degrees in which they can be performed, and there's degrees in which they manifest in a person's life. And does that mean, for example, that a person should walk around like be like a rubber band without any? No, that's not true. Yes, there is a necessity for flexibility, but you have to know how to apply the flexibility. That flexibility is not something that that's necessarily always desirable in and of itself. There is a certain desirability to flexibility, and that's why the middle column is the most important, because the middle column has qualities of the right-hand column and the left-hand column, and Korach separated those two. Peleg Korach, he split them apart, right? You're either right or you're left, you're either black or you're white, you're either friend or you're foe, you're either completely religious or completely irreligious, you're either a religious fanatic or an anti-religious fanatic. That's what happens, unfortunately. And the middle road, the middle path, is always the path that is suggested. Combine things, bring them together, balance them out. Everybody has a different balance, but you have to balance things, and that's the way it should be. Let's see some. Let me see here. The meaning of Korach. So yeah, that meant ice, and ice is to, what's the trilateral root? Kuf Reish Chet. Kuf Reish Chet is the trilateral root of, but it's also yeah, two of the letters are unbalanced over there, the Reish and the Kuf. Without going into it, did you know when the water is melting, it resets the memory of the water? At least that is what my study showed us to do with 108. Does 108 have significance in gematria? Yes, it does. It definitely does. The word 108 is the word kach, kufchet. But it could be the number. It could be a number of different things. 1 second here. I will soon tell you. Just wait 1 minute. Let me see here. I'm going to my gematria calculator. Here we are, gematria calculator. Yeah, should I share with you? let me share this with you. You might find this interesting. Share screen. Yeah, gematria calculator. No, is that it? Yeah. Can you see? It's called the gematria calculator. All right, so we ask now, what is 108? Okay, so there's a few things that are 108, 108. Quite a number of things, 108. All right, there was a sage whose name was Avtalion. Avtalion was the teacher of Hillel and Shammai. There you go. He was the teacher of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai are regarded as the two aspects of the teachings. Hillel is the aspect of chesed, kindness, and Shammai is the aspect of gvura. But they both received from Avtalion. Avtalion combined both of those together. And they too came together sometimes in agreement. They didn't disagree about everything, but they disagreed about quite a lot of stuff. But anyway, Avtalion was actually a ger tzedek. He was a convert to Judaism. It spells the word powder. It spells the words ears. Ears, interestingly enough. Right ear and left ear, which we try and get stereo rather than one or the other. It's also the gematria of Ilan Tov, the good tree, the tree of goodness. In other words, the tree of life rather than the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life. Let's see what else. There's some other things over here. I mean, there are many more, but not all of them. That's significant. There's another gematria, B'chol Yom equals 108 every day. And another one, B'limudav, in your learning. In your learning is also gematria of 108, but it's something that has to be combined. When you combine things together and you learn various things together, that is the proper way to go. That's 108. All right, there's many, many more, but suffice it to say, I've just shown you a couple of them. Okay, stop share for now. All right. I can listen to our questions and exceptional answers. Hey, you're welcome. 18 equals chai, that's right. Yeah, it means life. Unless you're hungry. Well, I'm not sure that was too. Was Korach given life, warmth, softness? It seems like ice cannot choose to be warmed, it's environmental. Korach was Kerach, he was rigid. He was rigid and he was cold. Yes, he was cold. He was rigid and cold. But the coldness came from inside, I think, just as much as from outside. Shabbat Shalom, best all. Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Oh yeah, by the way, today was Rosh Chodesh, so a good Chodesh to all of you. A good Chodesh meaning the beginning of the new month. You are very welcome, everybody. And I think we went way over time here. What's the time? Yeah, 9:15 almost. His whole family was destroyed. Yes, his whole family was destroyed, but the boys survived because they did tshuva. Chag Sameach and Rosh Chodesh Tov. Thank you. I think I'm going to try and edit my ums and ahs out of this thing if I can do it. I'm not sure exactly how to do it, but I'm going to try and do that. Okay. All right, everybody. Have a great one, and we will see you next week, hopefully. All the best. You're welcome. Yeah, I'll say more about the classes. Yeah, about the new classes. Sure, I will.